Continuing, we talked about integrative and agitation propaganda. A related point central in his thesis is that modern propaganda cannot work without education. He thus reverses the widespread notion that education is the best prophylactic against propaganda. On the contrary, he says, education, or what goes by that word in the modern world, is the absolute prerequisite for propaganda. In fact, education is largely identical with what Hillel calls pre-propaganda. So education is identical with what he calls pre-propaganda. The conditioning of minds with vast amounts of incoherent information already dispensed for ulterior purposes and posing as facts and as education. So this is that what is education is actually a pre-propaganda because it conditions our minds with vast amounts of incoherent information. So that's what I found out when I got into conspiracy theory, is that all these inconsistencies in the history that we had been taught were explained beautifully through the conspiracy theories. So it kind of answered some of my questions that I had when I learned all the facts in my education, which were incoherent and done for the purpose of conditioning my mind. So Hillel follows through by designating intellectuals as virtually the most vulnerable of all to modern propaganda. So there are three reasons why intellectuals are the most vulnerable to modern propaganda. Number one, they absorb the largest amount of second-hand, unverifiable information. Number two, they feel a compelling need to have an opinion on every important question of our time and thus easily succumb to opinions offered to them by propaganda on all such indigestible pieces of information. And number three, they consider themselves capable of judging for themselves. They literally need propaganda. So they think they can judge for themselves, they want to have an opinion on every important thing, and they also absorb the most amount of information, which is usually secondhand, unverifiable information. So for these three reasons, intellectuals are the most vulnerable to modern propaganda, and education is just pre-propaganda. That's what we learned in this paragraph. Next paragraph. In fact, the need for propaganda on the part of the propagandee is one of the most powerful elements of Hillel's thesis. Cast out of the disintegrating microgroups of the past, such as family, church, or village, the individual is plunged into mass society and thrown back upon his own inadequate resources. His isolation, his loneliness, his ineffectuality. Propaganda then hands him in veritable abundance what he needs: a raison d'etre, personal involvement and participation in important events, an outlet, an excuse for some of his more doubtful impulses. Righteousness, all factitious to be sure, all more or less spurious, but he drinks it all in and asks for more. Without this intense collaboration by the propagandee, the propagandist would be helpless. So he's saying that because we are all, like I said earlier, we are all individually broken down, and all the old units that bound us together, like family, church, and village, have all been disintegrated. Therefore, because of the lack of resources, and the isolation, loneliness, and ineffectuality, the propaganda from the news or from the conspiracy theorists uh, gives him an abundance of personal involvement and participation in important events, and an outlet, an excuse for the more doubtful impulses and fake righteousness. But therefore, the propagandist needs the propagandee to be involved. That's why I say most people are evil, because even the ones who are not causing the evil are still participating in the evil. So, thus, propaganda, by first creating pseudo needs through pre propaganda and then providing pseudo satisfactions for them, is pernicious. So, first it creates pseudo needs through pre propaganda and then it provides pseudo satisfactions for these pseudo needs, and therefore it is pernicious. So, can wholesome propaganda be made for a wholesome cause? Can democracy, Christianity, humanism be propagated by modern propaganda by modern propaganda techniques? Elo traces the similarities among all popular propaganda efforts, communist, Nazi, democratic. He thinks that no one can use this intrinsically undemocratic weapon, or rather abandon himself to it, unscathed or without undergoing deep transformations in the process. He shows the inevitable unveiled propaganda effects of which the good propagandist is unaware. The fallout from any major propaganda activity and all its pernicious consequences. Most pernicious of all, the process, once fully launched, tends to become irreversible. So propaganda is evil in itself, even though it's ubiquitous in our modern age, in the technological society. Elo critically reviews what most American authors have written on the subject of propaganda and mass media, having studied the literature from Lasswell to Reisman with great thoroughness. Accepting some of their findings, he rejects others, particularly the efforts to gauge the effects of propaganda. Elo believes that, on the whole, propaganda is much more effective, and effective in many more ways than most American analysis shows. Particularly, he rejects as unrealistic and meaningless all experiments that have been conducted with small groups. Propaganda is a unique phenomenon that results from the totality of forces pressing in upon an individual in his society, and therefore cannot be duplicated in a test tube. So that's a beautiful observation. He thinks that American research on propaganda has been limited because it only tests small groups and does not look at the totality of forces pressing in upon an individual in his society. So because Elul is a Frenchman, the French being the ones who gave us the Lady of Liberty statue, and having a more wholesome culture than ours, and having a foreign culture to ours, can observe our culture better and see the flaws in our analysis of propaganda. To make his many original points, Elul never relies on statistics or quantification, which he heartily disdains, but on observation and logic. So his treatise is a fully integrated structure of thought in which every piece fits in with all the others, be they 100 pages apart. In this respect, his work resembles the world as will and idea, of which the philosopher said that the reader, really to understand the book, must read it twice, because no page in the book could be fully understood without knowledge of the whole. So make sure to read this or listen to this twice after I finish reading the book. This procedure can hardly be suggested to the reader in our busy days, but he ought to be warned that to leaf through the book will not suffice. Paul Pickrell in Harper's Magazine said of Elul's The Technological Society that Elul, a great man, had written with monumental calm and maddening thoroughness a magnificent book. Elul's propaganda is no less maddening, monumental, and thorough. So what in Elul's view can mankind do? At the end of the book, Elul reaches neither a pessimistic nor an optimistic conclusion with regard to the future. He merely states that, in his view, propaganda is today a greater danger to mankind than any of the other more grandly advertised threats hanging over the human race. His super-analysis ends with a warning, not a prophecy. That was written in February 65 by Konrad Keller, the introduction. And then there's a preface. Which is kind of long, so I'll read it next time. That was the introduction by Konrad Keller of Propaganda.